The rain hammered against the windows of Marcus's apartment in downtown Portland, creating a rhythmic backdrop to what would become the most humiliating moment of my 30 years on this earth. I remember every detail of that October evening. The way the amber light from his kitchen lamp cast shadows across his sister Rachel's face, the half-empty wine glasses on the coffee table, the sound of my own heartbeat drowning out everything else after those words left his mouth. "Sarah's always been dramatic," Marcus said, his voice carrying the dismissive tone I'd grown to recognize over our 2 years together. "Honestly, Ratch, I don't know why I even bother anymore. Look at her. She's 30, still working at that dead-end marketing job, living in that tiny apartment. She thinks she's going to find someone better." He laughed, a sound that felt like ice in my veins. "No one will ever want you the way I do. Hell, no one will ever want you at all." Rachel shifted uncomfortably on the couch, her eyes darting between her brother and me. She was 26, successful in her own right as a graphic designer, and I'd always felt she saw through Marcus's facade better than most people. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, and I felt my cheeks burn with a mixture of rage and humiliation. I'd come over that evening to finally have the conversation I'd been avoiding for months. Marcus had been increasingly critical, increasingly controlling, and increasingly cruel. He'd started small, commenting on my clothes, my friends, my ambitions. Then it escalated to questioning my intelligence, my worth, my very existence in his life. I'd convinced myself it was stress from his job at the tech startup, that he didn't mean the things he said when he was tired or frustrated. But sitting there in his living room, with his sister as witness to his casual cruelty, I realized I'd been lying to myself for far too long. "Marcus," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "we need to talk. Alone." He rolled his eyes, taking another sip of his craft beer. "See what I mean, Ratch? Everything's always a big production with her. Can't we just have a normal evening without some dramatic conversation?" Something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the way he spoke about me as if I weren't sitting right there. Or maybe it was the accumulated weight of months of emotional abuse finally crushing my last shred of tolerance. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. "You know what, Marcus? You're right. This is dramatic, but not for the reasons you think." Rachel looked up at me, her expression shifting from discomfort to something that looked almost like hope, as if she'd been waiting for this moment as much as I had. "I'm done," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm done with your constant criticism. I'm done with you making me feel small and worthless. I'm done with you treating me like I'm lucky to be with you, when the truth is, you're the one who should be grateful." Marcus's face darkened. "Oh, here we go. The victim act again. Sarah, you're being ridiculous. Sit down and let's discuss this like adults." Adults don't tell their partners that no one will ever want them. Adults don't tear down the person they claim to love. Adults don't. I stopped, realizing I was shaking. "You know what? I don't owe you an explanation. I don't owe you anything." I grabbed my purse and my jacket from the chair where I'd left them, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the zipper. The apartment suddenly felt suffocating, the familiar space now tainted with the memory of his words. "Sarah, wait," Rachel said, standing up. "Let me." "Don't," Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp. "Let her go. She'll be back in a week, just like always. She needs me more than she wants to admit." Those words, the absolute certainty in his voice, the smug assumption that I would come crawling back, they were the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. I turned to look at him one last time. This man I'd thought I might marry, this man who had just systematically destroyed my self-worth in front of his own sister. "You're wrong," I said quietly. "I won't be back. Not in a week, not ever. And someday, when you're sitting alone in this apartment wondering where everyone went, remember this moment. Remember the night you chose cruelty over love." I walked out of that apartment and into the Portland rain, my tears mixing with the droplets on my face. My car was parked 3 blocks away, and by the time I reached it, I was soaked through. But as I sat in the driver's seat, key in hand, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: relief. The drive back to my tiny apartment, as Marcus had so dismissively called it, took 20 minutes through the rain-slicked streets of Portland. The city looked different somehow, as if I were seeing it through new eyes. The neon signs reflected in puddles seemed brighter. The late-night coffee shops looked more inviting, and even the gray October sky felt less oppressive. My apartment was small, that much was true. A one-bedroom in the Pearl District that I'd saved for 2 years to afford. But it was mine. The walls were painted the soft blue I'd chosen. The furniture was arranged exactly how I liked it, and nowhere in those 600 square feet was there a trace of Marcus's disapproval or criticism. I stood in my living room, still dripping from the rain, and looked around at the space I'd been apologizing for, the life I'd been minimizing, the dreams I'd been shrinking to fit into Marcus's narrow vision of who I should be. The marketing job he'd called dead end had actually been leading somewhere. I'd been working on a promotion, building a portfolio, networking with people who respected my ideas. That night, I ran a hot bath and sat in the water until it grew cold, thinking about the last 2 years of my life. I thought about all the times Marcus had made me feel grateful for his attention, as if his love was some kind of charity I didn't deserve. I thought about the friends I'd distanced myself from because he'd found fault with them, the family gatherings I'd skipped because he'd made me feel embarrassed about my background, the dreams I'd quietly abandoned because he'd convinced me they were unrealistic. But mostly, I thought about who I'd been before Marcus. The woman who'd graduated summa cum laude from University of Oregon, who'd backpacked through Europe for 3 months after college, who'd started her own small freelance design business before taking the corporate job for stability. That woman had ambition, confidence, and a clear vision of what she wanted from life. I realized, sitting in that cooling bathwater, that she was still there. She'd been buried under layers of manipulation and emotional abuse, but she was still there, waiting for me to remember her. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The rain had stopped, and October sunlight streamed through my bedroom window. I made coffee. Good coffee, the kind Marcus always said was too expensive, and sat at my small kitchen table with a notebook and pen. At the top of the page I wrote, "Life after Marcus, a plan." 3 weeks after walking out of Marcus's apartment, I was sitting in my boss Jennifer's office, palms sweating as I pitched the idea that would change everything. The Portland marketing firm where I'd worked for 18 months had been my sanctuary during the worst of my relationship, but I'd never pushed myself professionally the way I was about to. "So you're proposing we create an entirely new division focused on sustainable business branding?" Jennifer asked, her fingers steepled as she leaned back in her chair. She was in her mid-40s, with prematurely gray hair she wore like a crown, and the kind of confidence I aspired to have. "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've been researching the market, and there's a huge gap between what environmentally conscious businesses need and what marketing firms are offering. We could be the first in Portland to specialize in this niche." I had spent every evening for the past 3 weeks working on this proposal. While Marcus had been sending me texts that ranged from apologetic to angry to manipulative, I'd been diving deep into market research, competitive analysis, and financial projections. The work had been my lifeline, something concrete to focus on while I rebuilt my sense of self-worth. Jennifer flipped through the presentation I'd prepared, her expression unreadable. "This is impressive, Sarah. Really impressive. But it would mean a significant investment from the company, and we'd need someone to lead it who has the experience and confidence to make it successful." "I know I'm asking for a lot," I said, "but I believe I can do this. I've been working in marketing for 5 years, and I understand the sustainable business sector better than anyone else here. I'm willing to take on the risk." What I didn't tell Jennifer was that I needed this as much as the company did. I needed to prove to myself that Marcus had been wrong about everything: my ambition, my capabilities, my worth. I needed to build something that was entirely mine. "Tell you what," Jennifer said, closing the folder. "I'll give you 6 months to prove the concept. You'll get a small budget to start, and if you can bring in 3 significant clients and show profit potential, we'll talk about making this a permanent division with you as the director. I left that meeting feeling like I could fly. For the first time in months, I called my best friend Maya, who I'd been avoiding since the breakup because I was embarrassed about how long I'd stayed with Marcus. "Sarah, finally, I've been worried sick about you." Maya's voice came through the phone, warm and familiar. "How are you holding up?" Maya and I had been friends since college, and she'd never liked Marcus. She'd been too polite to say much, but I'd seen the way she'd tense up when he'd make his little cutting remarks during group dinners or parties. She was a therapist now, working with women who'd experienced domestic violence, and I realized she'd probably seen the warning signs long before I had. I'm doing better than I expected," I told her, walking through the Pearl District after work. The November air was crisp, and the city was settling into its cozy winter rhythm. I just pitched a huge project at work, and I think I might actually get it. "That's amazing. I'm so proud of you. And Marcus, how are you handling all of that?" I paused at a crosswalk, watching families and couples hurry past in the early evening darkness. He's been trying to contact me. Texts, calls, even showed up at my apartment last week. But I haven't responded to any of it. "Good," Maya said firmly. "Sarah, I hope you know that what he said to you, all of it was complete bullshit. You're one of the most capable, intelligent, beautiful people I know. He was threatened by you. That's why he tried to tear you down." Standing there on the corner of 10th and Burnside, I felt tears prick my eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of relief. "I'm starting to see that," I said. "It's scary, but I'm starting to see it. Listen, why don't you come over this weekend? I'll make dinner. We'll drink too much wine, and you can tell me everything. I mean everything. It's time you had someone in your corner again." That weekend at Maya's house in the Hawthorne district was exactly what I needed. Her small bungalow was warm and inviting, filled with plants and books and the kind of comfortable chaos that comes from actually living in a space rather than just existing in it. We sat on her couch with Thai takeout and a bottle of Pinot Noir from a local winery, and I told her everything. I told her about the gradual erosion of my self-confidence, the way Marcus had isolated me from friends and family, the constant criticism disguised as helpful suggestions. I told her about the night I'd finally left and about the weeks since then. "You know what I keep thinking about," I said, halfway through my second glass of wine. "I keep thinking about all the things I stopped doing because he made me feel stupid or selfish for wanting them. I used to paint, remember? I had that whole setup in my spare room, and I was actually getting pretty good at it." Maya nodded. "I remember. You did those beautiful landscapes of the Oregon coast. What happened to all of that?" Marcus said it was a waste of time and money. Said I should focus on practical things instead of hobbies that would never amount to anything. So I put everything away and converted the room into a home office for him to use when he stayed over. Jesus, Sarah. I know. I can see it now, but at the time it seemed reasonable, like I was being mature and compromising. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Compromising. That's what I called it when I gave up everything that made me happy. Maya reached over and squeezed my hand. "It's not too late. You can paint again. You can do all of those things again." The next morning, I woke up on Maya's couch with a mild hangover and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I drove to the art supply store in the Alberta Arts District and bought everything I needed to start painting again. Canvas, brushes, oils, a small easel. The total came to over $300, money I would have agonized over spending when I was with Marcus. But as I loaded the supplies into my car, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't frivolous. This wasn't selfish. This was me reclaiming a part of myself that had been buried for too long. Back at my apartment, I cleared out the spare room that had become Marcus's unofficial office. I threw away his books, his extra clothes, the stupid motivational posters he'd hung on the walls. I opened the windows to let in fresh air and natural light, and I set up my easel in the corner where the light was best. My first painting in almost 2 years was terrible. My hand was out of practice, my color mixing was off, and I couldn't seem to capture what I was seeing in my mind. But I didn't care. I painted for 3 hours straight, losing myself in the process in a way I'd forgotten was possible. Over the next few weeks, I fell into a new routine. I'd wake up early, work on my sustainable branding project before heading to the office, put in a full day at work, and then come home to paint. I was busy, challenged, and for the first time in months, I was excited about the future. My first client meeting for the new division was with a small organic coffee roastery in southeast Portland. The owner, David, was a man in his 50s who'd left a career in finance to pursue his passion for coffee. He was exactly the kind of client I'd envisioned when I'd proposed the sustainable branding division. "The thing is," David said as we sat in his cozy cafe, surrounded by the rich aroma of freshly roasted beans, "I know my product is good. I know my business practices are ethical, but I can't seem to communicate that to customers in a way that makes them choose us over the big chains." I pulled out my portfolio of ideas, concepts I'd been developing specifically for businesses like his. What if we focused on storytelling instead of just marketing? What if we helped customers understand not just what you're selling, but why you're selling it? We spent 2 hours talking about his vision, his values, and his dreams for the business. By the end of the meeting, he'd agreed to a 6-month contract that would cover a third of my budget requirement for the new division. Walking back to my car, I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. I had identified a need in the market, developed a solution, and sold it based on my own expertise and vision. Marcus's voice, the one that had lived in my head for so long telling me I wasn't good enough, was getting quieter every day. That night, I celebrated by cooking myself a real dinner. Not the frozen meals I'd been living on, but actual food that required time and attention. I made pasta with homemade sauce, opened a bottle of wine, and ate at my kitchen table while looking out at the city lights. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "I saw your LinkedIn post about the new project. I'm happy for you. Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. I had nothing to say to him. I was building a life without him, exactly as I'd promised I would. 6 months after leaving Marcus, I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror in my apartment, getting ready for the company holiday party. The woman looking back at me was someone I barely recognized, not because I looked different, but because I carried myself differently. My shoulders were straighter, my smile was genuine, and there was a confidence in my eyes that had been missing for a long time. The sustainable branding division had exceeded all expectations. What had started as a desperate attempt to prove my worth had become one of the most successful launches in the company's history. I'd brought in 7 clients in 6 months, generating enough revenue to secure my position as the new director and hire 2 additional team members. But success at work was just part of the transformation. I'd been taking a pottery class at a local studio, had rekindled my friendship with several people I'd lost touch with during my relationship with Marcus, and had even started dating again, though nothing serious yet. I was learning to enjoy my own company, to trust my own judgment, and to believe in my own worth. The holiday party was being held at a trendy restaurant in the Pearl District, and as I walked in, I felt the familiar flutter of social anxiety that had plagued me during my relationship with Marcus. He'd always made me feel like I was performing at social events, like I needed to be someone other than myself to be acceptable. "Sarah." Jennifer's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. "There's someone I want you to meet." She led me over to a group of people I didn't recognize, all impeccably dressed and clearly important. "This is Tom Bradley from Bradley & Associates. They're the PR firm that's been handling the Johnson account, and I've been telling him about your work with sustainable branding." Tom was probably in his early 40s, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of easy confidence that comes from years of success. He shook my hand firmly and smiled. Jennifer tells me you've revolutionized how this company approaches environmental marketing. I'd love to hear more about it. For the next hour, I found myself in animated conversation with Tom and several other business leaders about market trends, innovative approaches to brand storytelling, and the future of sustainable business. I was holding my own in discussions about topics I was passionate about, and I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't second-guessing every word that came out of my mouth. "You know," Tom said as the evening wound down, "my firm is looking to expand into the sustainable market. Would you be interested in discussing some potential collaboration opportunities?" I was about to respond when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Sarah." I turned around, and there was Marcus. He looked exactly the same, still handsome in that carefully cultivated way, still dressed in clothes that were just expensive enough to signal success. But something about him seemed smaller somehow, diminished. "Marcus," I said, my voice steady despite the sudden racing of my heart. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here with a client," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the bar. "I saw you from across the room, and, well, I wanted to talk to you. You look—" He paused, his eyes taking in my appearance. "You look really good." Tom and the others had discreetly moved away, giving us privacy, but I could feel their curious glances. I was acutely aware that this was a professional setting, that how I handled this interaction would be noticed and remembered. "Thank you," I said simply. "How are you?" "I'm good. Great, actually. The startup got acquired by a bigger company, so I'm doing really well." He paused, and I could see him struggling with what to say next. "Sarah, I've been thinking about that night, about what I said. I was wrong." "Yes, you were." My directness seemed to surprise him. The old Sarah, the one who'd been with him for 2 years, would have made excuses for him, would have rushed to make this conversation comfortable for him. But I wasn't that person anymore. "I miss you," he said quietly. "I miss us. I know I screwed up, but I've been working on myself. I've been seeing a therapist, and I realize now that I was threatened by your success. I was taking out my own insecurities on you." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something I hadn't expected: pity. Not the kind of pity that comes from superiority, but the kind that comes from genuine sadness for someone who has lost something valuable through their own actions. "I appreciate you saying that, Marcus. I really do. But an apology doesn't undo the damage." "I know that," he said quickly. "I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I'm asking for a chance to show you that I've changed. Maybe we could get coffee sometime, just to talk." I was quiet for a moment, considering. 6 months ago, I might have said yes. I might have been flattered by his attention, grateful for his regret. But the woman I'd become in those 6 months, the woman who'd built a successful career, who'd rediscovered her passions, who'd learned to value herself, that woman knew better. "Marcus," I said gently, "I don't think that's a good idea. I'm not the same person I was when we were together, and honestly, I don't think you are either, at least not in the way you need to be. We're both different people now, and those people don't belong together." His face fell, and I could see the old Marcus, the one who didn't handle rejection well, starting to surface. "So that's it? You're just going to throw away everything we had?" "I'm not throwing anything away," I said firmly. "I'm protecting something I've built. I'm protecting myself." "From what?" "From someone who loves you." The question hung in the air between us, and I realized this was the moment I'd been preparing for without knowing it. This was the test of everything I'd learned about myself, about my worth, about what I deserved. "Marcus," I said, my voice calm but strong, "love doesn't tell someone that no one will ever want them. Love doesn't systematically tear down someone's confidence and dreams. Love doesn't make someone feel like they have to apologize for existing. What you felt for me wasn't love, it was possession, and I will never, ever allow myself to be possessed again." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to argue, but couldn't find the words. Finally, he nodded. I guess I deserve that." "You deserve to figure out what real love looks like," I said. And so do I. But we're not going to figure it out together. He left after that, walking away through the crowd of holiday party guests with his shoulders slumped in defeat. I watched him go, waiting for the familiar pang of regret or doubt that had always followed our arguments when we were together. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt something I'd never experienced after an interaction with Marcus. Peace. Tom reappeared at my elbow with a glass of wine. Everything okay? Yeah, I said, accepting the glass gratefully. Everything's perfect. Ex-boyfriend. Ex-life. I corrected and he laughed. I like that. Ex-life. Much more dramatic. He paused, then added, For what it's worth, I couldn't help but overhear some of that conversation. You handled it with a lot of grace. Thank you. I've had a lot of practice standing up for myself lately. Good skill to have in business, too, he said. Listen, I meant what I said earlier about collaboration. Would you be free for lunch next week to discuss some ideas? I smiled, feeling the familiar thrill of a new professional challenge. I'd love that. The rest of the party passed in a blur of networking and conversation, but I found myself thinking about the encounter with Marcus, not with sadness or regret, but with a kind of amazement at how far I'd come. 6 months ago, I'd been a woman who thought she was lucky to be loved by someone who treated her badly. Now I was a woman who knew she deserved better than that, and who was building a life that reflected that knowledge. Later that night, I sat in my apartment with a cup of tea and my sketchbook, working on ideas for a new painting. The spare room had become my studio, and it was filled with canvases, some finished, some works in progress, all of them expressions of the creativity I'd rediscovered. My phone buzzed with a text from Maya. How was the party? Did you dazzle everyone with your brilliance? I smiled and typed back, something like that. I'll call you tomorrow and tell you about it. But as I set the phone aside, I realized that Maya's question had been more accurate than she'd probably intended. I had dazzled people with my brilliance, not because I'd performed or pretended to be someone I wasn't, but because I'd finally allowed myself to be the person I'd always been underneath all the self-doubt and criticism. The woman who'd walked out of Marcus's apartment 6 months ago had been broken, humiliated, and convinced that she was lucky to be loved at all. The woman sitting in this apartment now, surrounded by her art, her success, her hard-won independence, knew better. She knew that love wasn't something you had to be grateful for. It was something you deserved, something that should build you up rather than tear you down. And if the right person came along who understood that, wonderful. But if not, she was complete on her own. She was enough, exactly as she was. 2 years after walking out of Marcus's apartment, I was standing in the lobby of a downtown Portland hotel, adjusting my name tag and trying to calm my nerves. I was about to give the keynote speech at the Pacific Northwest Sustainable Business Conference, talking about authentic brand storytelling in the age of environmental consciousness. The conference had drawn nearly 500 business leaders from across the region, and my presentation was based on the success of the sustainable branding division I'd built from nothing. In the 2 years since that terrible night, my small experimental project had grown into a full department with 8 employees and a client roster that included some of the most innovative companies in the Pacific Northwest. 2 years ago, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the microphone. I was in a relationship with someone who told me I'd never amount to anything. He said no one would ever want me, that I was too ambitious, too demanding, too much. For a while, I believed him. A hush fell over the audience, and I could see people leaning forward in their seats. I tell you this not for sympathy, but because I think it illustrates something important about authenticity. When we allow other people to define our worth, when we shrink ourselves to fit into someone else's vision of who we should be, we lose sight of what makes us unique. And in business, uniqueness is everything. The applause was thunderous, and as I left the stage, I felt the same sense of accomplishment that had become familiar over the past 2 years. During the networking lunch that followed, a young woman approached me. "Excuse me, are you Sarah Chin? I'm Jessica Martinez. I just wanted to thank you for your presentation. I'm starting my own business, a line of ethically sourced clothing, and I've been struggling with how to market it without sounding preachy or fake. Can I give you some advice?" I asked. The best marketing comes from genuine belief in what you're doing. Don't try to convince people to care about ethical fashion. Find the people who already care and show them how your business aligns with their values. Driving back to my apartment after the conference, I thought about that conversation with Jessica. 2 years ago, I'd been like her, passionate but uncertain, full of ideas but lacking the confidence to pursue them. My apartment had evolved too. The spare room was now a proper art studio, filled with paintings I'd created over the past 2 years. I'd also started dating again, though I was much more selective now. Currently, I was seeing David, the coffee roaster who'd been one of my first clients. Our relationship had developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared values. He was kind, supportive of my ambitions, and secure enough in himself that he didn't need to diminish me to feel important. "How did the conference go?" he asked when I called him that evening. "Really well. I think I might have some new clients coming out of it." "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "I know how hard you've worked to get to this point." Later that evening, sitting in David's kitchen while he prepared dinner, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The pain of that night 2 years ago had been real and devastating, but it had also been the catalyst for the most transformative period of my life. "I keep thinking about who I was 2 years ago," I said. "That woman who walked out of Marcus's apartment in the rain. She was so broken, so convinced that she was lucky to be loved by someone who treated her terribly. And now you're giving keynote speeches to 500 business leaders and running one of the most successful marketing divisions in the city," David finished gently. "It's not even about the professional success," I said. "It's about the fact that I like who I am now. I genuinely enjoy my own company. I'm not afraid to be alone, but I'm also not afraid to be with someone who truly sees me." Driving home that night, I thought about the text messages I'd received from Marcus over the past 2 years. They'd started frequent and desperate, then became angry, then eventually faded to occasional attempts at reconnection around holidays. I'd never responded to any of them, not because I was trying to punish him, but because I had nothing to say to the person he'd been or to the person I'd been when I was with him. Back in my apartment, I walked through the rooms that had once felt like a shameful compromise, the tiny apartment Marcus had mocked. Now I saw them for what they were, a sanctuary I'd created for myself, filled with art and books and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you belong in your own life. I stood in front of my latest painting, a vibrant landscape of the Oregon coast at sunset. The colors were bold and confident, nothing like the tentative, apologetic work I'd done in the early days after leaving Marcus. This painting knew what it wanted to be, just like I did. I'd learned that Marcus had been wrong about everything. Someone would want me, several someones in fact. But more importantly, I'd learned that it didn't matter. My worth wasn't determined by someone else's desire to possess me. I was enough exactly as I was. I was enough when I was alone, building my career and pursuing my passions. I was enough when I was with David, sharing meals and dreams and quiet moments. The woman who'd walked out of Marcus's apartment had been searching for herself in all the wrong places. But the woman who stood in this apartment now, surrounded by art she'd created, success she'd built, and relationships she'd chosen, she knew better, and she did.